In today's technique tutorial, I'm going to be talking you through a movement pattern known as the hip hinge. Now, being able to hinge from the hips is really important for movements such as a kettlebell swing or for deadlifts as well. Now, as opposed to a squat, where you would set up in position and think about trying to sit down into the movement and then driving away from the floor, driving the hips up, a hinge from the hips looks at being able to drive the hips backwards and then extend up and forwards. So for a kettlebell swing as an example, the momentum that you create from the hinge, being able to drive forwards, is where the power of the movement comes from to drive that kettlebell up out in front of you. Now, when we look at this movement being executed, one of the biggest faults that we see is that instead of being able to drive the hips back and keep the back in a straight line or a closed position, we see a lot of people really struggle and almost sit down into the movement too much. And we also see a lot of rounding through the upper back as well. So obviously that's going to put a lot more stress on the spine whenever you're swinging a kettlebell. And also that sitting action is more of a squat action as opposed to a hip dominant movement as well. Now, there's something really simple that you can do in order to learn the movement pattern as a hip hinge. And we use something like a piece of dowel or maybe a broom handle, and we place it up against our back as a bit of a teaching aid. Okay, so for this example here, I'm going to use the dowel up against my back, so it's in contact with the back of my head, it's running down the spine, and it's also at the back of my hips as well. And I'm just going to use my hands just to hold it in position. So when I set up over the top of the kettlebell, I've got my feet around sort of hip width apart. I'm going to soften my knees slightly, but then from here, what I'm going to work on is trying to drive the hips backwards, keeping my back, my head and my hips in contact with the dowel all the way through. So in this position here, I'm starting to feel the glutes starting to work, and also a little bit of a stretch into the hamstrings as well, which is perfect because that tells us that what we're doing is creating tension through that posterior chain as we hinge and then drive up and forwards. So the way to do this technique again is to use the dowel or the broom handle, make sure it's in contact with the back all the way through. You probably do maybe 10 to 15 repetitions just to warm up and just to get used to that movement of hinging from the hips and then driving up and through with the hips to squeeze the glutes at the top. Really simple drill to do, will really help you to protect your back and set up in the right position so that when you do kettlebell swings, you're generating the force through the hips and not using a squat pattern or rounding the back too much as well.